Stan, we've spoken a great deal about the motion picture side, the film side of the business. Can you bring us back into the theatrical side of Roscoe's business?
Yeah, I think probably it's more interesting to speak in terms of anecdotes, and I guess thinking back, I think in terms of incidents and anecdotes over the years, certainly as opposed to financial statements.
Yes.
I was never much for financial statements. But I remember dealing with a wonderful lighting designer, Abe Fader, who did a lot of the big Broadway shows and in the 70s, 80s, and show Camelot, which certainly comes to mind because it was a beautiful show, a lot of lavenders, blues, pinks, and it was a show that we were heavily involved in. Fader had worked a lot with Rosenstein, and Fader was not the smoothest in terms of working with people, and he would call Rosenstein that Dutchman. I don't think Rosenstein was a Dutchman, but that was Fader and Rosenstein. It was something to watch. But when I came along, and some years later, I think it was around 72 probably, that he was working on Camelot. And by then the company was up in Harrison, New York, up in Westchester. And I got a call one afternoon, and typical Fader style, it was Miller. That was a term of endearment from Fader. You want your color on this show? Yes, Mr. Fader. Then get your down here, bring some sheets of color. So I packed up an assortment of sheets, went into the city expecting a long evening, and Abe Fader had an easel set up with Oliver Smith's sketches, which were done in the paints that were going to be used for the sets. So he had the sketches on the easel, and his ideas for what he was going to use for color. And he had a pipe with some lights on it, and he had a ladder. The ladder was not for Mr. Fader, and cut up some of the sheets, and he would try out different blues, for example, or lavenders, and I would go up the ladder and drop the frames in the lights, and he would see the effect on the paints sets. Well, in many cases, with the lavenders, for example, he wasn't satisfied with one piece of number 117. He would put two pieces in a frame. So he would write down, okay, we'll do double 117. Well, I ran up and down the ladder. And of course, he's complaining and grousing and cursing and, I mean, totally unpleasant and snarly. At the end of the evening, he says, it was so nice to come down. And as my mother would have said, butter would melt in his mouth. He's the sweetest man. Well, I mean, how would you refuse, the nasty Fader, and here's the sweet Fader. And of course, he's using our color. I would have crawled to come down and get a Broadway show. So that night, not only did he select all our colors, but he invented about 8 colors by doubling colors. Because, God forbid, we didn't have enough colors at that point. He has to invent colors. And we made them for him because they were good colors. So we ran a minimum run so that he has enough colors. The show opens at the O'Keefe Center in Toronto. And in fact, it opened the O'Keefe Center in Toronto. And it ran something like 4 hours. The audience just was locked in. They wouldn't let them leave. But it was obviously much too long. So they cut out an hour and a half of the show, cutting out many of the colors that he invented, and we ran. So, but they did keep, I think we added 3 or 4 colors that we ran for Feta, for Camelot, that are still in the line. Several of the lavenders that we have today were developed that night for Feta, for Camelot. And that's how the line grew and grows. Designers, Tom Skelton for the Ohio Ballet, added colors as Skelton Sangria, you know. So many of the important designers have come up with colors that we keep. So that's why the swatch book is, you can barely lift it.
Yes.
So the whole range has grown over the years for the theatrical designers. Not because we, you know, if they say, I want this color, we must add it. But we're back to your theme, following the customer. I mean, these are brilliant professional artists. If they conceive of a color, who knows better? You know, there are people all over the world who will use that color because they found a lavender that Feta came up with for Camelot. How could we say no? And to this day, I mean, Theron for Chorus Line, colors. West Side Story, colors. They're perfect. Why would you not include it in your range? Storaro, Vittorio Storaro, cinematographer,
Absolutely.
Italian, had already gotten several Academy Awards. He was in New York for New York Stories. He was shooting Coppola's daughter directing. He was going to China for Last Emperor. Yeah, and he knew everything was going to be on a huge scale. He loved to use big diffusion panels, you know, 12 by 12, 20 by 20. He was concerned about wind noise. You take a big sheet of plastic that size, and it rattles in the wind. So he wanted a diffusion quality of full diffusions, but he wanted it quiet. So he was in New York finishing that movie. We had lunch, and I invited him up that weekend to come up here to Stamford. He was off, and he did. We had lunch up here, and Jim Meyer, our West Coast manager, was in town. Jim, Vittorio, and I had lunch in Stamford. And he was very concerned about taking the noise out of diffusion. So after lunch at the table in the restaurant, as we always do, we had swatch books on the table. We're trying to eat. He's thinking about this perfect diffusion he wants, but not noisy. We came back here to the house. And so we start with diffusion. And we had brought some pieces because he couldn't work with the swatchbook, and took the shade off the lamp in the living room, and he's creating diffusions with the living room lamps. And here in the living room, he created silent frost because he couldn't live with a noisy diffusion in China. When you get, a 2020, it's just too much noise. So he decided that this was the right diffusion quality, and it was up to us to have that diffusion quality, but in a material that didn't make noise when it blew in the wind. And we did. And it's in the range, and he used it, in the Emperor. But more important, he's used it ever since, and a couple of other people have bought it too. But it's that sort of thing, dealing with a specific problem. You can understand if you're going to do, 6 by 12 by, big sheets of material outdoors, you have to deal with the wind. It's real. Years ago, we had a swatch book, which we called the Jungle Book, because once the crews left the studio, which is a protected environment, there's nothing there that you don't put there. You may have wind in the studio, but it comes from a big machine that you rented and put there. Once you go outside, you've got parking lot lights, you've got helicopters, you've got everything. It's a jungle. Well, that's where we come in. So you can screw up your lighting to match the fluorescence in the supermarket, and then the lab can correct, or you can correct. We'll give you materials to screw up your lighting to match what you ran into, because then you can deal with it. That's our job, to give you the tools to deal with the jungle out there that you deal with.